Hi, I'm Michael Bueller with Horizon3ai. I'm a senior engineer here with Horizon 3. Prior to that, I was a Splunk engineer and professional services consultant working for the public sector team and doing tech lead and cloud and core. So kind of running and guiding the implementation of products and deployments of different pieces of Splunk's security stack and IT operation stack. Before that, I kind of lived in the world of the intelligence community. So I worked for Northrop Grumman and General Dynamics doing Java development, and kept my clearance and kept working with Splunk in that same space. So that's how I got a chance to meet the co-founders of Horizon 3, Tony Pilitary and Sneh Hall and Tony. Both were they were out at JSOC, where they got a chance to meet each other, and that's where I got a chance to meet them. So that's who I am. We started this new thing with the cartoons for everybody's like picture and stuff, and one of our guys really started that, and it's been kind of cool to have in and out. So just fun things. So the whole point of our talk today is to discuss, seeing your environment through the eyes of an attacker. So, when we talk through seeing your eyes through the environment of an attacker, there's different perspectives that you're starting from. So as a blue team, what do they see? They see logs. They see 45 screens full of logs. They see 27 different summaries and outputs and different, pieces and parts of what to do and the vulnerabilities that are out there. But that really doesn't tell you what the attacker sees. It doesn't tell you what's going on, and it doesn't tell you how to deal with it. It just tells you that you have a problem. And on top of that, vulnerable does not mean exploitable. So when you're looking from a defensive perspective, just because there's a vulnerability there doesn't mean that there's a practical way to exploit it today, or a practical way to exploit it at all. Only 5% of all of the vulnerabilities that are out there, especially in vulnerability scanners, are actually exploitable. So the other 90 some odd percent, 95% are vulnerable but not exploitable. So that means that you're going to fix it, and there's value to fixing it, and being compliant. Not trying to say that that's not important, but if you focus first on the exploitable side, you're going to end up with more proactive posture in your network. So that really helps to drive and guide the focus, right? Blue teams see it as a defensive position by default, right? Their goal is to keep the castle safe. And the red team, if you have a red team or you work with the red team, larger scale, you'll have that for sure. Their job is to go in and attack, right? Come up with the new novel things and find ways to get in. So what does a red teamer see, right? He sees a whole bunch of code and a whole bunch of, different things to do. You've got stack traces, and you've got your overflows and your heap and all of that. But does that really matter when it comes down to if you have to do 427 different things to actually complete an exploit? Is it practical? So the other side of that is, if it's not practical, then is it really exploitable? And if it's exploitable but not practical, is it really something you need to worry about to start? Right? This is all from the side of stepping into an environment. There's definitely places for fighting for, getting as many vulnerabilities as you can handle, but focusing on what you can fix and focusing on what makes a tangible change is really important to make sure that what you're doing is going to be, changing the posture, not just changing the day-to-day operations. So what does, and this is supposed to say attacker, and I managed to not update that, so I'm sorry. What does the attacker see? The attacker sees, he's got a machine he's compromised internally. The assumed breach perspective is a pretty valid perspective today. Everybody's going to have some sort of a breach at some point, whether that be malware, phishing, some sort of virus, some flavor of all three, remote persistence, or advanced persistent threat from a nation state maybe. So the attacker sees a path, and what they're trying to do is find the easiest path or any path to your crown jewels. What keeps them going is trying to find that end state, right? So they want to get to whatever you're trying to protect. That's their whole entire intent. Um, with that, what we want to do is look at it from that perspective. Look at it from the side of, what does an attacker see? When an attacker sees a web page, he doesn't see a web page. He sees 27 different vulnerabilities that might exist, and 5 of those that are exploitable. And so he's going to go through that list, right? All right, so is this Jenkins, or is this, XYZ? Is it Confluence? Is it, a custom web app? And then step into that and look and go, how can I compromise it? And then they're going to use a compromise, and they're going to see how they can chain that together. So, the perspective of, every single piece being perfectly defended, from the standpoint of an attacker is, very challenging, because there's always going to be something that's not quite configured how you expected, or not set up how you wanted, or there are 0 days out there that exist that, in the products today that are fully patched, with air quotes, right? Fully, have no vulnerabilities today doesn't mean that there's not vulnerabilities in the product. So working to build the team mindset around, how do we identify this behavior, right? Not these specific actions. The specific actions here that they're going through are somewhat, um, pointless from the standpoint of the training, from the standpoint of the team or the tools you're using, because you need to see, what does an attacker do? How does an attacker act? And then how do I take those steps and tie them into our posture, whether that be blue team, red team, both. That's kind of why we call, the perspective of the 2 of those, that purple team, right? So it's one on each team, or one group of people working together to build the posture of defense and attack, informing one another. So where do we start? What do we do, right? So how do we, we've got a problem. It's definitely a problem, and it's all over the place today. What do we do with it, right? So the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure we're logging what matters. Um, everybody wants to log everything, and not everybody can have the budget to do that. And coming out of the government, there are 2,700 different ways to justify what you have to log. And then you just have a big pile of logs that aren't necessarily being used for much. So the challenge is, what do you use, or how do you decide to take those logs and pick the ones that are important for you as a red teamer, or as a blue teamer, or the flavor of the 2 in between? So you should be logging to see attacks, right? You should be logging to see what an attack looks like, and then finding the ways to fingerprint that. So as you look through the eyes of that attacker, what do they do, right? So they log in, but they don't try and log in the first time on, your domain controller. They're going to go to your PDUs, or they're going to go to your UPS devices, or they're going to go to an IoT SCADA device, or they're going to log directly into that Wi-Fi extender that has a default password. So that's where they're going to start. They're going to gain access and persistence, and then they're going to determine where they can pivot. So if you start looking for things like that, looking for those behaviors that are outliers, we can start going down the path of, when I see things like that, what should we be doing? What action should we take? And then how do we employ different tools, tactics, tools, and techniques, and procedures, is the other one I was looking for, but anyway, to actually make this change. So as we dive in, what does that look like? Does that look like 3 logins? Does that look like 2 different attempted logins? What does that look like? Do I see nmapping across the network? Do I see probing for remote access? What do I see? The other part of this is, collecting a mountain of logs does not necessarily mean you have the data to identify these problems. So from that perspective, this is around the side of, when you can aggregate data, assuming that you don't have some sort of a requirement to not aggregate data, or when you can use the data you have and distill it down to something that's more consumable, that gives you an advantage, because you're able to sift through that data more quickly and give more content, or more context around the content for what's going on. The other side is, if you haven't had a chance to, or if you don't have a lot of east-west, in between machine security, which is often the case, right? You have a very open internals, then adding monitoring from either host-based firewall or Sysmon or EDRs is another good way to start seeing the tipping, right? That initial data set for attacks. So as you start walking through that, you see, oh, I see this host had XYZ happen. This host had XYZ happen. How do we build a behavioral model behind that to look at it? So that's really what, when we talk about logging, that's really what we want to focus on. So when we talk about purple teaming and we talk about security, we talk about IT operations, we dive into that. We really want to look at it from the perspective of, starting slow, doing something, but don't go crazy to start. Find something, and then that one change you can tune and tweak and make better. That's a very iterative approach. From the standpoint of vulnerabilities, typically it's the same idea, right? You want to walk through and find that one thing that's exploitable, repair it, fix it, mitigate it, whatever you need to do, remediate it, and then walk through that and see what that, see that you can verify that now it's been fixed. That's that side of it. I see, Ian, you posted a question about honeypots. Can you give me another word or two on the end of that? I'll come back, no problem. I didn't know if it was related specifically to what we were talking about here yet. So if you want to share more, feel free to. So when we're doing that, what does it look like, right? So we start the pattern, the purple teaming pattern, from a logging perspective of, what do we do? We find what the attacker did, and then we instrument it. We find where our holes are, and we instrument it. So that's the side of that. And then we take it and we go, all right, now I've instrumented it. Now let's run another one, whether that be a red team or a tool that helps with that. Let's run another scan and let's see what that looks like. So now we've run 2 scans, and we've, for exploits or operations, whatever you want to call them today, right? And now you've seen, did I see what I wanted to see? Now let's go through and tune it. So work as a team to go, all right, blue team is now getting the output of what the red team did, and let's take that and use that to make it better for what we're doing. So instead of, one of my colleagues on the last time we were presenting something similar to this, he was mentioning how, when you have a red team inside doing work, right? So you've got like if you're working for the DoD, or you have another, penetration test, or red team stepping in to do the actual penetration test or red teaming for you, there's a certain level of heightened awareness that goes with that. So everybody's looking and digging deep into the logs, and where can we find them, and how can we stop them, and what's going on? And that's not sustainable, that's not maintainable. And so you end up in a state of that hyper awareness when someone's there doing something. How do you do that on Thursday at 6 o'clock at night? Right? How do you start building that process? How do you start building the behaviors behind that? So building out this process, the iterative process around exploits, vulnerabilities, and also what you're going to log. So when you do that, when you're looking at what you're doing with all those different perspectives, the intent is to get better at what you're doing, right? Good security practitioners, good system admins, good network, administrators, they all want to get better at what they're doing. So how do you build a process that breaks down that barrier of, I work in IT, you work in security, go away, there's nothing wrong here? Or how do you break down the side of, the only time security shows up for a sysadmin is when something is broken or going to be broken because of a new vulnerability. So we've got to step through those and go, how do we build that process back? So that's kind of the goal here. Start slow, make some changes, but definitely dive in and keep making things better. So what can we do from the standpoint of diving in deeper on the side of machine learning and the side of understanding how our data is being used? Use machine learning. Our adversary is, there's quite a few recent data points around conditional access providers, the people getting the access for the ransomware teams to step into the environment, where they've actually detected the use of machine learning as part of their strategy to find access, whether that be um, probing or finding different weaknesses or vulnerabilities, or seeding how they're choosing to walk into an attack. They're using it day in and day out, and they're starting to use that as a tactical advantage for them. So let's take that and start using it on our side. It doesn't have to be complex. It doesn't have to be crazy. There's a lot of, there's kind of two sides to machine learning. One side is definitely I have a PhD, I'm using machine learning day in and day out, but that doesn't always translate into alertable, actionable things. It's really good for understanding the grand scheme of things, but sometimes that doesn't always map over to a team whose job is to respond to a problem. And then the other side of it is I'm running a search in my tool. Why does it matter, right? What is it? So what? I have a spike on my graph. Who cares? And it's putting the context around that to identify what that really means. So if we start with something as a simple, and it's supposed to, anyway, we start with something simple, run a regression, find the outliers, right? Find that one or two sigma deviation from the standpoint of orders of magnitude, and look at it and see what that really is, and see if it's something important. That drives the next step, right? Anomaly detection drives that next step. So when you start looking at your network through the eyes of attacker, those are kind of the pieces and parts there. The other side of that is when you start working the two security teams together, you start working the red team and the blue team together. How do you have a sparring partner there that's going to help both of you get better, right? The blue team is not a subject matter expert in red teaming. The red team is not a subject expert in blue teaming necessarily. That's more likely to see that crossover, but in general, they don't have crossing over skill sets. So taking those two and finding a sparring partner of some way, whether that be something that does breach attack simulation or does very specific pointed simulations of attacks or autonomous type tools that are out there to do that. If you start looking at that, finding that sparring partner that can give you a simulated attacker is really helpful to walk through the logging perspective, the red team and the blue team, to get deeper, right? It's very hard to emulate an attack and know that you're ready to handle it. So finding a tool that will help you to do that is really important. Finding a way to dive in. I know as a prior practitioner from the standpoint of implementation of Splunk and SOCs and SIEMs and SOARs and all of the other acronyms, insert soup here, that getting to the point of comfortability around what you're actually logging and seeing is one step. But I never had the confidence that I would know for sure when someone was attacking or trying to compromise my network. Because it's hard to contrive. It's hard to do in a way that's consumable. So that's kind of my perspective on that. Machine learning, though, is a two-edged sword. So when we walk through this and we look at it, knowing your data is still imperative, and knowing your team and their choices and behaviors is still imperative. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater from the perspective of that one data point that you had could be really valuable or really important in a certain context. So the perspective being diving into how do we look at this? How do we take the pieces and parts we have and make sure that we're not throwing out valuable data, but also not including data that is leading us down the wrong path. Part of machine learning doesn't answer every question, and machine learning won't give you the answers except for what you desire to get out of it, I guess would be the way I'd say that. So from the perspective of one of the other guys I was working with, he says that you can torture data to get any answer you want. Enough times going through the same data, you can find your answer that you're looking for, but there's an inherent bias to that. So looking at it from the perspective of both an offense and a defensive perspective, red team, blue team, you start driving that data back to where that data came from or whose perspective is looking at it, right? The red team may have a very different view of that data than a blue teamer. So as you start fusing those two together and you start thinking about them from that perspective of offense informing defense and defense, giving offense the differences in their attacks, helps to start looking at it from a more well-rounded perspective. It was always super fun to see a blue team find a red team or a red team not gets found by a blue team, but it's still that adversarial mindset. It's very much not working together. So that's, from that perspective, really important. Now we want to choose our lens wisely, right? So back to, you can tell your data to tell you whatever you want it to tell. Just because you got a chart or a graph out of this does not mean that it's really helpful or really valuable. There's a lot around data science that is science. It's not, it's still all in that world of figuring things out. So you want to make sure that you're looking at your lens, your view, right? And that was a big thing around, as a prior Splunker, there was always the way you could shift your lens to see what you needed to see, but you had to be cognizant of that lens view being skewed, right? Or being off for your perspective. So we always wanted to be thinking about, what is that end state you want? What is the goal, right? What question are you trying to answer? And then walk back from that question and find the data that helps to answer that question without looking for the assumed answer to that question. There's a couple of times where I've been working on larger IT projects. I did some work for Center for Medicaid Services for a while on Health and Human Services, and they have a lot of web pages, and they would always come back and go, well, we need to see that the website is up or down. It's like, okay, well, we can tell you it's up or down, but at what level do you want that fidelity? Your data has to be consumable from a perspective of whichever way you're coming, in a way that's healthy, but also, the right answer with air quotes. So you don't want to tell the director that the system's down every 10 minutes if you have, a SQL server that's acting up, right? But you also don't want to ignore that if you are the DBA. So the lens that you're looking through and the data that you're gleaning tells two different stories, right? You have degraded state possibly, but you're not down. Or you could have reduced performance, but you're not down. Or you're, what is that threshold? What does that lens look like? What does the timing look like? So there's a lot around building that out. The other part I would say is, as you look at this, when you start trying to find something to work with the team, work with your different data that you have, you want to dive into finding something that helps you to do that, right? Honeypots, Ian, is a great way to do that. So, those definitely give you a perspective, learning how to build your tool set and your skills out with things like Hack the Box or what is it, ihack.net or whatever that one is, the other tool like that, right? Those are great things to really practice your skill sets at, and then also to see different perspectives. Tools like I said, breach attack simulation are awesome. They do a good job of bringing that to a consistent light. The only problem with that is it's very consistent. So it's easy for teams to, from a lens perspective, start looking at the pattern of that specific attack, not the behaviors that that attack is showing. So that's, as we dive into all of this, we want to be thinking about not the specifics of a compromise or the specifics of what's done. The flash is less important than how we got there. So how do we start feeling that out? How do we start, fingerprinting that in a way that's consumable, right? So you've got to pick a framework that works for you, right? There's lots of different frameworks. There's lots of different choices. Start with tracking what's going on. Find see what you find, and then when you walk back through, do the retrospective, right? A kind of a site reliability type of perspective. That has always been valuable from my perspective. And I think being an engineer, a software engineer first, and then coming into the world of IT operations definitely changed my perspective on that, because I saw it as a not just root cause analysis, but how do we get better at what we're doing? So look at what you're seeing and look at what you're not. And whether that output is from your vulnerability scanner or that output's from your antivirus today or whatever it is, start with that and see what you see and see what you don't see. Find other tools that are extensible. So as a team that's growing, so the frameworks I'm talking about are kind of the underpinnings around what you're doing. So whether that be the tools from the standpoint of what you're trying to build out, or the end state that you're doing. So if you're a red teamer, find a tool that's extensible. If you're a blue teamer, find the tools that are open. There's a lot of free and open tools out there that give you the insight you need. Coming from, taking my Splunk hat off for a second, having worked there, there's a lot of value to Splunk, and there's a lot of really awesome parts of it, but that doesn't mean that everybody can afford or chooses that to be the solution. So when I think of framework flexibility, I'm thinking of interoperability. So how do we collect the data in an agnostic way, but still not make extra work for ourselves, right? So we can pivot to whatever we want to visualize it. How do we look at our data on the stream, right? Which is a huge power that I wish I had had earlier in my career of IT and data and security. Is how do we look at that data on the stream, right? The process of looking at that may be very specific, but plumbing it up should be somewhat agnostic. So the more flexibility you bring here, the more we can tune and tweak and integrate tools very easily. Whether that's through APIs, or the other thing I've seen a fair bit is, especially when we talk about data, is placing it into queues or streaming in a way that's more flexible. So if you take, your data and you're able to put it to an SQS queue, or you're able to send it to SNS, or send it real time via a different method like that, it gives you the flexibility to now have consumers that are doing that, right? So same idea around that. When we talk about red teamers, Nuclei Framework is an awesome framework for fingerprinting and identifying weaknesses specifically in web type products. It's awesome. The really cool thing is, I don't know if any of you guys got a chance to see, guys and gals, excuse me, got a chance to see the recent Apache, the 3 Apache vulnerabilities that were released. Our team actually submitted the template, the Nuclei template, framework template for that. And so when we did that, that's what was the impetus for that team to release their actual specific exploits, because we were fingerprinting it now. We could see it, we could identify it. So things like that are really cool, where you can take something new and emerging and use it as a practitioner. And that's what do you find next, right? So then the other thing we've had with specifically using Nuclei Framework is we've gone on the other side and we're out working with it, and we'll see evidence of another possible exploit. And that's brought us several 0 days that we've been able to kind of resubmit back to those vendors and help them to fix it. So it's a two-sided coin there of looking at what the attackers are seeing and they're using today, right? That's that behavior side. But also when I look at my environment, what would they see if they were looking for something? The other side is understanding your CVEs. So there's a lot of data around specific CVEs when you look at the severity or you look at the exploitability that may or may not give you fidelity around what it really means for your network or your environment. A CVE is somewhat taken in a vacuum. And so when you look at that from that perspective, what does that really mean related to the other things on your network, your mitigations and remediations? So from that perspective, that's another piece there. At the bottom here, I've got our tool, the Horizon3 Node 0. And what that really does is kind of fuses all this together. So we take the pieces and parts of these different frameworks, we take the autonomous side of being that attacker and that decision-making side and put it all together. So that's kind of my side of that. at this point, I'll kind of open up for questions and we can dive in a little bit further. But yeah, like I said, I don't want to dive into a sales side of things, but that's what looking through the eyes of an attacker really should mean. And then, use some of these tools that are out there to make it better or easier.
So I have a quick question.
Yes, ma'am.
Are you stopping for questions again at a later time?
Nope, I was going to stop here.
You're gonna stop here. All right, so I'm
Yep.
gonna stop the recording then.
For some reason, I thought I only had like 40 or 45 minutes the last couple of the ISSAs I've been with. That's been that window. So sorry.
Oh, we're more generous.
Except for when someone shows up thinking it's different.